So today I am talking to Nandini Das, who is Professor of Early Modern Literature and Culture at the University of Oxford. Nandini is a leading scholar of Renaissance literature and cultural history, working especially on travel and cross-cultural encounters and issues of migration and belonging. She's written and edited a number of books, is editing a volume of the forthcoming edition of Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, and is author of a personal favourite article of mine, 2016's Encounter as Process, England and Japan in the late 16th century, which you can read in Renaissance Quarterly. Nandini is a BBC New Generation thinker and makes regular appearances on BBC TV and radio, including as presenter of the BBC4 TV documentary Tales of Tudor Travel, The Explorer's Handbook. And relevant to our conversation today, Nandini is the principal investigator on the European Research Council funded project Travel, Transculturality and Identity in England, circa 1550 to 1700, also known as TIDE. So with that overview of just some of your achievements, Nandini, that's all we have time for. We'll just leave it there. No. I wanted to see if I could start by asking you to introduce the TIDE project and tell people what it's about.
Of course, and thank you for inviting me to talk about TIDE. So TIDE is funded by the European Research Council. It's a 5-year multidisciplinary project which started in 2016. And at the heart of it is a very simple question, which is about identity and English understanding of what identity, national identity means, particularly when it comes to those pesky, problematic individuals who insisted on crossing boundaries of language or nationality or religion, either willingly or unwillingly. So the basic question that we begin with is this idea of what happens to those people who cross those boundaries. Do they have to choose sides, essentially? Be this or that, or was there something of a conceptual betweenness in this particular period? And that issue, that question kind of creeps into multiple debates, as you know. I mean, there are legal experts in this period wrangling about who inherits what. Can a stranger's son inherit a stranger's property if that wealth is made in England, or should it go back to the crown, for instance? On the kind of religious theological side, there are multiple questions about what happens with conversion. What happens when your religious faith and your national identity pulls in different directions, for instance. And then of course, there is literature. There's the whole imaginative interrogation of those ideas. And what TIDE tries to do is drill into those definitions, those conceptions, and also those imaginings.
So one of the things that I think is amazing about TIDE is that, alongside this fantastic team of scholars and this set of research interests, it's also a project that has managed to have impact and to use the funding language, to generate outputs in other areas and to go beyond the academy. I think is really important. The way that it's spoken to different publics and tried to call for change or to generate change beyond scholarly discussion. It's something I think is really exciting. And I wanted, if I could, to kind of take you back to the beginnings, when you were conceiving of TIDE in the first instance and beginning to put together, say, that bid for the European Research Council funding. How did you take those first steps in deciding the kinds of activity or the kinds of collaboration beyond, say, the strictly academic that wound up being part of TIDE?
Well, I'm going to be really, really frank here. So when I first started thinking about the proposal itself, I had that dreaded phrase in my first draft, the one that involves stakeholders in this project, that we're all at some point guilty of having used. And I had this vague idea that there would be stakeholders. I wasn't quite sure who they would be, but there would be some, surely. And they would come for the lukewarm tea and soggy biscuits and conversation around a table. But once the project kind of got going, something that became increasingly clear was the kind of abstract stakeholder involvement that I had in mind was really not up to the mark at all. My stakeholders essentially initially were the students who had joined in the first year fresh out of their A-levels, and were being thrown into the deep end of cultural history and English literature and asking really difficult questions about identity and migration and race. This was also the point where, 2016, when there was a huge upsurge in the debate and public consciousness about immigration. Tide began just after the referendum had happened in the UK. So there was that collective kind of debate and consciousness about it as well. By about 6 months down the line from our research beginning, really, one of the things that we generated was a policy engagement position paper, essentially. And that was basically an invitation to 3 areas, one of which was school education, the second was heritage, and the third was the arts and creative industries in general. Largely because those were the 3 areas where we thought we could perhaps offer our research for others to use in some way or the other. But it was very clear to me and to the rest of the team from the very beginning that particularly when it came to education, we didn't want to, or we didn't feel that it would be particularly useful simply to create educational resources that we circulate among teachers. We wanted it to be a genuine conversation. And we wanted that conversation to start quite early. So for me, it was a rapid education, really, in the structure of education systems in the UK. My own background is from India, so the UK education system was very new to me. So it was a rapid kind of quick learning in the different kinds of exam boards and structures, and what on earth people mean when they kind of casually refer to KS3 or Key Stage 3, that kind of thing. But what emerged from that whole conversation really was this understanding that if we really wanted to get involved in education policy, it needed to be something that taps into multiple similar conversations that was going on across the country at various different levels. So it was very much initially a kind of building of networks and building of understanding of what else was happening. We were very, very lucky to have very strong partners from the beginning, very patient and generous partners who led us into that field. And that's how we got started.
That's you mentioned those conversations that are already ongoing, and that's really my next question is, I've seen from we're going to talk about your report in a few minutes, but I've seen from reading the report that you really point up the contributions that had kind of been made beforehand, conversations and reports that preceded the work that you did. So were there particular approaches or initiatives that you saw and thought, okay, this is inspiring to us, this is an approach we'd like to build on?
Very much so. So one of the exemplars for us, for instance, was an online resource called Our Migration Story, which was established a few years ago, and it's a wonderful resource. Cross-historical, starts from the kind of earliest. I think it starts from the Vikings essentially, and comes right down to contemporary issues, and is chock full of historical documents and analysis, all geared towards the teaching of migration-related and identity-related themes at A-level, essentially, but it can be used earlier. So when we were thinking about resources, our initial first stop really was to get in touch with the Runnymede Trust, who were very much involved in that production of that particular resource. And we were very lucky to work with some wonderful people at the Runnymede Trust, Malachi McIntosh and Kimberly McIntosh. So we started off by thinking about, essentially about almost like an academic scoping study of those conversations that were going on, both in and around the topic of migration, but also other kind of initiatives that were addressing similar problems. So one of the issues when we started thinking about identity, race, and migration in the teaching of those issues in schools, one thing that emerged very quickly from our very initial workshops in London and in the northwest of England was that the problem wasn't a lack of willingness in schools to teach those subjects. The problem really was that these are really difficult topics to teach. And no matter how many teaching resources we as university-based academics and researchers might churn out, they will still remain really difficult subjects to teach for teachers who are juggling multiple other commitment kind of responsibilities and commitments. So that idea of getting into conversations with teachers and equipping them with the pedagogical kind of framework, as well as material, was really important from the very beginning, for instance. And we were very lucky to have a multiple education kind of experts to come in within that conversation for us.
And it comes back to what you were saying about not just creating resources and putting them out there in the hope, but rather taking maybe a more active approach and trying to engage with the teachers who can really put this stuff into action. Which brings me then to talk about a really interesting aspect of Tide's engagement with teachers, which is the Beacon Fellowship, which ran in 2019. And so you getting involved in training and supporting teachers. Can I ask you, what did that involve? What was the process behind the Beacon Fellowships?
Well, the Beacon Fellowship came up from one conversation during our very first scoping workshop with teachers in the northwest of England. There we were in a kind of subterranean room at the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool, talking to these teachers. And I still remember one of them turning to me and saying, you know, what you really need to do is talk us through this material, just as you're doing now. But do it at less ungodly hours, will you?
And with slightly better catering. That's fantastic.
And from that conversation, we started thinking, well, yes, you know, perhaps less ungodly hours and a more detailed, more supportive framework could be something that we could contribute to. And we were very lucky at that point. Tide was based at the University of Liverpool. And we were very lucky to get some institutional funding, which allowed us to put together a 12-week intensive course, essentially, which involved a lot of online material, a lot of online conversation among teachers who were given a bursary to attend this course from the Tide project and from the University of Liverpool. And we had 12 teachers who responded to our kind of call from across the UK, from various different schools, different kinds of schools, inner city London schools to more select, shall we say, a kind of a very different kind of intake of students in the Wirral in the northwest, for instance. And what we did with these teachers was really an intensive course on culture and literature of the 16th and 17th centuries and those ideas and terms that circulate within it, dealing with issues of race and migration, interspersed with quite hands-on sessions. We were very lucky to have the support of the Slavery Museum in Liverpool and the National Archives down at Kew, where we could take the teachers in and actually show them the historical documents, the literary texts that we had been talking about over the last week or couple of weeks, and talk through